The scorching Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her position behind the weathered boulder. Her Barrett M82 rifle rested steady against the makeshift bipod she had constructed from fallen branches and rocks. The scope's crosshairs swept across the valley below, searching for any sign of movement among the scattered buildings of the remote village. Sarah had been in position for 14 hours now, and her body ached from maintaining the same cramped posture. But she remained motionless, her breathing controlled and rhythmic. This was what she had trained for during those grueling months at sniper school, where she had been the only woman in a class of 32 Marines and soldiers. The radio crackled softly in her earpiece. "Overwatch, this is Ground Team Alpha. We're moving into position now. Keep your eyes open." Sarah keyed her radio twice to acknowledge without speaking. Sound carried far in the desert, and even a whisper could compromise her position. She had learned this lesson the hard way during her first deployment, when a careless comment had nearly gotten her entire squad killed. Through her scope, she watched as the SEAL team moved like shadows through the narrow streets below. They were some of the best operators in the world, but even they needed someone watching their backs. That someone was her. The mission was supposed to be simple. Intelligence had indicated that a high-value target was hiding in the village, a Taliban commander responsible for several attacks on coalition forces. The SEALs would move in, capture or eliminate the target, and extract before enemy reinforcements could arrive. But Sarah knew that nothing was ever simple in Afghanistan. She had been deployed here for 8 months now, and she had seen too many routine operations go sideways. Her job was to provide overwatch and eliminate any threats that might endanger the ground team. The village appeared peaceful from her elevated position. Goats wandered through the dusty streets, and she could see a few women hanging laundry on rooftops. But Sarah's trained eye caught details that others might miss. The way certain windows remained shuttered despite the morning heat. The absence of children playing in the streets. The goats that seemed unusually agitated. Something was wrong. Sarah's finger hovered near the radio button, but she hesitated. The SEAL team leader, Master Chief Petty Officer James Rodriguez, had made it clear during the briefing that he didn't appreciate what he called unnecessary chatter from support elements. He was old school, one of those operators who believed that snipers should remain silent unless they had a confirmed target. But Sarah's instincts, honed by months of combat experience, were screaming warnings. She had survived this long by trusting those instincts, even when it meant going against the wishes of senior personnel. She watched as the 4-man SEAL team approached the target building, a 2-story mud brick structure at the center of the village. They moved with practiced precision, each man covering his assigned sector. Rodriguez led from the front, his weapon sweeping left and right as he advanced. The building's front door stood slightly ajar, another warning sign that Sarah noticed immediately. In her experience, doors in Afghan villages were either wide open or securely closed. A partially open door suggested someone had left in a hurry, or worse, it was an invitation for the unwary. Through her scope, Sarah could see Rodriguez raise his fist, signaling for his team to halt. He had noticed the door too. The team stacked up against the wall beside the entrance, preparing for their entry. That's when Sarah saw the first muzzle flash. It came from a window on the second floor of a building across the street from the target. The shooter was well concealed, using the shadows and a carefully positioned curtain to hide his position. Sarah estimated the range at approximately 400 meters from her position, well within her effective range. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley as more shooters opened up from concealed positions throughout the village. The SEALs immediately took cover, returning fire as they tried to identify the source of the incoming rounds. "Contact! Contact!" Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, strained but controlled. Multiple shooters, unknown positions, were pinned down. Sarah had already acquired her first target through the scope. The shooter in the second-floor window was tracking one of the SEALs with his AK-47, preparing for another burst of fire. Sarah controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow as she entered the zone that every sniper knew well. The crosshairs settled on the center of the target's chest. Sarah squeezed the trigger slowly and steadily, following through with perfect form. The Barrett's massive .50 caliber round covered the distance in less than half a second. The enemy shooter collapsed backward, his weapon clattering to the floor. But there was no time for Sarah to admire her handiwork. She was already scanning for the next threat. "Where the hell is that coming from?" she heard one of the SEALs shout over the radio. "I can't see the shooter." Sarah spotted movement in a doorway to the north of the SEAL position. Another fighter was positioning himself for a flanking shot, carrying what appeared to be an RPG. This was a much more serious threat than the rifle fire. She adjusted her aim, leading the target slightly as he moved. The man stopped in the doorway, raising the RPG to his shoulder. Sarah's second shot took him in the upper torso, the heavy round's impact sending him tumbling backward. The RPG round fired wildly into the sky, exploding harmlessly against a distant hillside. "Good shot, Overwatch," Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, and Sarah could hear the relief in his tone. "We've got movement to the east as well. Can you see anything?" Sarah was already scanning in that direction. Her elevated position gave her a commanding view of the entire village, and she could see what the ground team could not. At least 6 more fighters were moving through the buildings, using covered routes to approach the SEAL's position. "Multiple contacts moving in from the east," she reported. "Count 6, possibly more. They're using the buildings for concealment." "Can you take them out?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah was already tracking the lead fighter as he sprinted between buildings. He paused at a corner, exposing just enough of his body for her to engage. Her third shot of the day found its mark, and the man dropped immediately. The other fighters, now aware that they were being targeted by a sniper, began moving more carefully. But Sarah had the advantage of position and optics. She could see them clearly through her high-powered scope, while they had no idea where she was located. One by one, she began eliminating the threats. Each shot was carefully considered, each target prioritized based on the immediate danger they posed to the ground team. A fighter with a machine gun took precedence over one with a rifle. Someone carrying grenades was more dangerous than someone with just small arms. "Jesus Christ," she heard one of the SEALs mutter over the radio. "Where's this fire coming from? It's like having guardian angels." Master Chief Rodriguez was more practical in his assessment. "Overwatch, you're doing outstanding work up there. Keep it up." But Sarah was beginning to face a problem. The remaining enemy fighters had figured out that they were being engaged by a sniper, and they were adapting their tactics. Instead of exposing themselves in the open, they were using smoke grenades and staying within the buildings. She could hear Rodriguez coordinating with his team over the radio. "We need to move before they get organized. Overwatch, can you provide covering fire while we advance to the target building?" Sarah keyed her radio. "Affirmative. I have your back." The SEALs began their advance, moving in short rushes from cover to cover. Sarah watched their progress through her scope, ready to engage any threat that appeared. Her ammunition was running low after the engagement, but she still had enough for a few more critical shots. As the team reached the target building, Sarah saw a new threat emerging from a building to the south. 3 fighters were setting up what looked like a heavy machine gun on a rooftop. If they got that weapon operational, it would pin down the SEALs indefinitely. The range was longer than her previous shots, nearly 600 meters, and the targets were partially concealed behind a low wall. Sarah would have to thread the needle, putting her bullet through a narrow gap to reach the gunner. She took her time with this shot, accounting for wind drift and bullet drop at the extended range. The crosshairs settled on the visible portion of the gunner's torso, and Sarah gently pressed the trigger. The shot was perfect. The gunner slumped forward over his weapon, and the other 2 fighters immediately abandoned their position, dragging their wounded comrade with them. "Outstanding shooting, Overwatch," Rodriguez reported. "We're entering the building now." Sarah continued her vigilant watch as the SEAL team disappeared into the target building. Her sector of responsibility had grown quiet, but she knew that enemy reinforcements could arrive at any moment. Intelligence reports suggested that there was a substantial Taliban presence in the area, and the sound of gunfire would draw them like moths to a flame. Minutes passed in tense silence. Sarah's radio remained quiet except for the occasional tactical transmission from inside the building. The SEALs were conducting their search methodically, clearing each room and looking for their target. Then Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, and Sarah could hear the frustration in his tone. "Overwatch, the building is clear, but our target is not here. Looks like he left in a hurry, probably when he heard us coming." Sarah wasn't surprised. The partially open door and the organized ambush suggested that the Taliban had been warned of the SEALs' approach. Someone had tipped them off, either through careless operational security or through deliberate betrayal. "We're coming out," Rodriguez continued. "Be ready to cover our withdrawal." Sarah adjusted her position slightly, preparing for the team's exit. She knew that the enemy would try to hit them as they left the building when they would be most exposed. Her instincts proved correct. As the first SEAL emerged from the building, gunfire erupted from multiple positions throughout the village. The enemy had used the time during the building's search to reposition and prepare for this moment. Sarah went to work immediately, identifying and engaging targets as they revealed themselves. A sniper on a distant rooftop, a fighter with an AK-47 firing from behind car, another shooter positioned in a second-story window. Her ammunition was running critically low now, and she had to make every shot count. The Barrett held 10 rounds in its magazine, and she had started the mission with only 3 magazines. 27 rounds for what had turned into a much larger engagement than anticipated. "We're taking heavy fire," Rodriguez reported. "Need immediate extraction." Sarah could see the extraction helicopter approaching from the east, a UH-60 Black Hawk flying low and fast. But the landing zone was still hot, with enemy fighters positioned to engage the aircraft as it landed. She prioritized targets that could threaten the helicopter. A fighter with an RPG launcher was her primary concern, followed by anyone with a heavy machine gun or other crew-served weapon. Her remaining bullets had to count. The helicopter flared for landing in a cloud of dust and debris. The door gunners opened up with their M240 machine guns, suppressing enemy positions while the SEALs sprinted toward the aircraft. Sarah watched through her scope as Rodriguez and his team reached the helicopter and climbed aboard. The aircraft immediately lifted off, banking sharply to avoid ground fire as it gained altitude. "Overwatch, this is Ground Team Alpha." Rodriguez's voice came through the radio as the helicopter pulled away. "We're clear of the LZ. Thanks for the outstanding support up there." Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she began breaking down her position. The mission hadn't achieved its primary objective, but the team had extracted safely, and that was what mattered most. As she packed her equipment, Sarah reflected on the engagement. She had fired 17 rounds and achieved 17 hits, each one precisely placed to neutralize a threat to the ground team. It was the kind of performance that would normally earn recognition, perhaps even a commendation. But Sarah knew that recognition was unlikely to come. As a female sniper attached to special operations units, she operated in a shadow world where her contributions were often overlooked or minimized. The men she supported were usually professional and appreciative, but the institutional military still struggled to accept women in combat roles. The extraction helicopter would return for her once the SEALs were safely back at base. Until then, she would wait in her concealed position, watching for any sign that the enemy had discovered her location. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Sarah settled in for what could be a long wait. The desert was peaceful again, with no sign of the violent engagement that had just concluded. But she remained alert, knowing that in Afghanistan, peace was always temporary. The radio crackled with the voice of the helicopter pilot. "Overwatch, this is Dustoff 7-2. We're inbound to your position, ETA 10 minutes. Sarah began her final preparations for extraction. She carefully cleaned her rifle and packed it in its case, erasing all evidence of her presence on the hilltop. In a few hours, she would be back at the forward operating base, writing her after-action report and preparing for the next mission. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had done her job well, protecting warriors who didn't even know her name. In the Brotherhood of Arms, sometimes that was enough. The sound of approaching rotor blades grew louder, and Sarah gathered her equipment for the short hike to the landing zone. Another mission was complete, and tomorrow would bring new challenges in the endless war against terror. As the helicopter touched down and she climbed aboard, Sarah caught the eye of the crew chief. He gave her a thumbs up and shouted over the engine noise, "Hell of a shooting day, ma'am." Sarah nodded and strapped herself in for the flight back to base. Through the helicopter's window, she watched the village recede into the distance, already planning improvements for the next mission. There was always a next mission in Afghanistan, and she would be ready when it came. The war was far from over, but today had been a good day. The good guys had gone home, and that was all that mattered in the end. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, and new opportunities to prove herself in a world that still questioned whether women belonged on the front lines of combat. But Sarah Chun was exactly where she wanted to be, serving her country and protecting her fellow warriors one perfectly placed shot at a time. The desert sun set behind them as the helicopter carried her home, and she was already thinking about the next time she would hear those words echoing across a battlefield. "Where's the shooter?" 3 weeks after the village engagement, Sarah found herself lying in a different kind of hell. The mountainous terrain of eastern Afghanistan presented challenges that the desert never could. Sharp rocks cut through her gear, and the altitude made every breath a conscious effort. But the real challenge was the cold that seeped through her clothing despite the warming layers she wore. The mission brief had been straightforward enough. Intelligence had located a Taliban safe house in a remote mountain village where several high-value targets were reportedly meeting. This time, there would be no advance warning, no opportunity for the enemy to escape. The strike would come in the dead of night when the targets were most vulnerable. Sarah's position was even more isolated than usual. She lay nearly a kilometer away from the target building, positioned on a rocky outcrop that provided an unobstructed view of the entire valley. The extreme range would test her skills to their limit, but it was the only position that offered both concealment and a clear field of fire. The SEAL team for this mission was different from the last one. Master Chief Rodriguez had been rotated home, replaced by a younger operator named Chief Petty Officer Michael Thompson. Thompson had a reputation for being thorough and professional, but he was also known for being skeptical of support elements that he hadn't personally worked with before. During the mission briefing, Thompson had made his concerns clear. "I don't care what happened on your last operation," he had told Sarah bluntly. "This is a new team with new objectives. You follow my orders exactly, and you don't take any shots unless I specifically call for them. Is that understood?" Sarah had simply nodded and replied, "Understood, Chief." But privately, she wondered how Thompson would react when the bullets started flying. In combat, rigid plans often became meaningless, and adaptability was more valuable than blind obedience. The insertion had gone smoothly. The helicopter had dropped her at a landing zone 5 kilometers from her final position, and she had made the approach on foot during the early evening hours. The climb to her overwatch position had been brutal, but she had arrived with time to spare before the SEALs began their movement. Now, as midnight approached, Sarah watched the target building through her night vision scope. The structure was larger than the previous target, a sprawling compound surrounded by a low stone wall. Intelligence suggested that up to 15 enemy fighters might be present, including several foreign advisors from Pakistan and Chechnya. The thermal imaging attachment on her scope revealed heat signatures moving within the building. At least a dozen people were inside, far more than the intelligence estimate had suggested. Sarah keyed her radio to report the discrepancy. "Ground Team Bravo, this is Overwatch. I'm counting 12 to 15 heat signatures in the target building, significantly higher than brief numbers." Thompson's response was curt. "Overwatch, Maintain radio silence unless you have immediate threats to report. We're aware of the increased numbers. Sarah frowned, but acknowledged the transmission with 2 clicks of her radio. Something about Thompson's response bothered her. How could they be aware of increased numbers when the intelligence had been finalized just hours before the mission began? The SEAL team began their approach at 0130 hours. Sarah tracked their movement through her night vision equipment, watching as the 4-man team moved like ghosts through the rocky terrain. They were good, she had to admit. Even knowing where to look, she sometimes lost sight of them as they used the natural terrain to mask their approach. The village was completely dark except for a few scattered oil lamps burning in windows. But Sarah's thermal imaging revealed that the night was far from peaceful. Guards were positioned around the compound, and she could see at least 3 sentries patrolling the perimeter. As the SEALs drew closer to their target, Sarah began identifying potential threats. The guards were well-positioned and alert, suggesting a higher level of training than the average Taliban fighter. These were professionals, possibly foreign advisors or specially trained cadre. The first guard was positioned near the compound's main gate, sheltered behind a low wall that provided cover from ground level, but left him exposed to Sarah's elevated position. The range was nearly 900 meters at the extreme edge of her effective range for a precision shot. The second guard was moving in a patrol pattern around the eastern side of the compound. He carried an AK-47 and what appeared to be a radio, making him a priority target if the operation went loud. The third guard was barely visible on the roof of the main building, positioned to watch the approaches from the west. Sarah plotted each guard's position and movement pattern, preparing for the moment when she might need to engage them. But Thompson had been clear about his rules of engagement. She was to remain silent unless specifically called upon. The SEAL team reached the compound wall without being detected. Thompson's hand signals coordinated his team as they prepared to breach the entrance. Sarah watched through her scope as they placed explosive charges on the gate and prepared for their assault. That's when everything went wrong. The explosion that opened the gate was the signal for a devastating ambush. Gunfire erupted from concealed positions throughout the compound as enemy fighters poured out of buildings and took cover behind walls and vehicles. The SEALs were caught in a kill box, with enemies firing from multiple directions. Contact! Contact! Thompson's voice came over the radio, strained with the stress of combat. Heavy resistance were pinned down at the main gate. Sarah could see the entire battle developing through her scope. The intelligence had been wrong in more ways than one. This wasn't a safe house with a few high-value targets. It was a fortified position with a substantial garrison, and the SEALs had walked into a carefully prepared trap. Enemy fighters were moving to flank the SEAL position, using covered routes that would allow them to attack from multiple angles. Sarah could see at least 20 fighters, far more than anyone had anticipated. The 4-man SEAL team was outnumbered 5-1. A fighter with an RPG was climbing to a position on the roof of a nearby building. From there, he would have a clear shot at the pinned-down SEALs. Sarah centered her crosshairs on his chest and prepared to fire. Overwatch, what's your status? Thompson's voice crackled through the radio. I have multiple targets in sight, Sarah responded. Request permission to engage. Negative. Hold your fire unless I give specific authorization. We're trying to break contact and withdraw. Sarah watched in horror as the RPG gunner reached his position and began aiming at the SEALs. In seconds, he would fire a round that could kill or wound multiple team members. Her finger hovered over the trigger as she waited for permission that might never come. The gunner steadied his weapon and prepared to fire. Sarah made a decision that would haunt the rest of her military career. She ignored Thompson's order and took the shot. The .50 caliber round struck the RPG gunner's center mass, sending him tumbling backward off the roof. The rocket-propelled grenade fired wildly into the air, exploding harmlessly against a distant mountainside. God damn it, Overwatch. Thompson's voice was furious. I said hold your fire. But Sarah was already engaging her next target. A machine gunner was setting up his weapon in a position that would enfilade the SEAL team's retreat route. She put a round through his chest before he could get his gun operational. More enemy fighters were appearing from buildings throughout the compound. Sarah began systematically eliminating threats, prioritizing targets based on the immediate danger they posed to the ground team. A sniper on a rooftop, a fighter with grenades moving to flank the SEALs, another machine gun crew setting up in a second-story window. Each shot was taken at extreme range, requiring her to account for wind drift, bullet drop, and the movement of her targets. But Sarah was in the zone now, operating at the peak of her abilities. Shot after shot found its mark, disrupting the enemy's coordinated assault on the SEAL position. "Where the hell is that sniper fire coming from?" she heard one of the SEALs ask over the radio. "It's our overwatch," Thompson replied grudgingly. "She's disobeying direct orders, but she's keeping us alive." Sarah continued her methodical destruction of the enemy force. Her elevated position and night vision equipment gave her a tremendous advantage over fighters who were struggling to identify her location. They knew they were being engaged by a sniper, but they couldn't determine where the shots were coming from. "Overwatch, this is Ground Team Bravo," Thompson called. "Can you see our extract route to the south?" Sarah scanned the area with her scope. Several enemy fighters were moving to block the team's withdrawal, setting up an ambush along the only viable escape route. "I count 6 hostiles moving to block your extract route," she reported. "I can clear them, but I need you to keep them distracted for 30 seconds. "Do it," Thompson replied without hesitation. The SEALs opened up with concentrated fire toward the compound, forcing the enemy fighters to take cover. Sarah used the distraction to systematically eliminate the ambush team, picking them off one by one as they exposed themselves to return fire. "Extract route is clear," she reported. "Move now while you have the chance." The SEAL team began their withdrawal, bounding backward from cover to cover as they made their way toward the extraction point. Sarah provided continuous overwatch, engaging any enemy fighter who tried to pursue or cut off their retreat. But her ammunition situation was becoming critical. She had started the mission with only 2 magazines for the Barrett, and she was down to her last few rounds. Each shot had to count more than ever. An enemy fighter with an AK-47 broke cover and sprinted after the withdrawing SEALs. Sarah tracked him through her scope, leading his movement as he ran between the rocky outcroppings. Her bullet caught him in mid-stride, sending him tumbling into the rocks. That was her last round. Sarah began breaking down her position immediately, knowing that her muzzle flashes had finally been spotted by some of the enemy fighters. She could see them moving in her direction, trying to locate and eliminate the sniper who had devastated their ambush. The extraction helicopter was inbound, but it would take several minutes to reach the landing zone. Sarah would have to evade enemy forces with only her sidearm and whatever tactical skills she could muster. She abandoned her heavy Barrett rifle, taking only her M4 carbine and essential equipment as she began moving toward the extraction point. The rocky terrain provided good concealment, but it also slowed her movement as she picked her way carefully through the darkness. Behind her, she could hear enemy fighters shouting in Pashto and Arabic as they searched for her position. Flashlight beams swept across the rocky landscape, and she could hear the distinctive sound of AK-47s as the fighters fired at shadows and suspicious shapes. Sarah reached a small ravine that provided concealment and began moving more quickly toward the extraction point. The helicopter's rotor blades were becoming audible in the distance, growing louder as the aircraft approached. "Overwatch, this is Dustoff 6-1. The pilot's voice came through a radio. "We're 2 minutes out from your position. Pop smoke when you're ready for pickup." Sarah reached in her gear and pulled out a purple smoke grenade. She would wait until the last possible moment to deploy it, giving the enemy fighters as little time as possible to identify her location. The helicopter appeared over the ridgeline, flying low and fast toward the designated landing zone. Sarah activated the smoke grenade and tossed it into the clearing where the aircraft would land. Purple smoke billowed up into the night air, clearly marking her position for the helicopter crew, but also revealing her location to any enemy fighters in the area. Sarah sprinted toward the landing zone as the aircraft flared for touchdown. Gunfire erupted from the darkness behind her as enemy fighters spotted the smoke and began shooting at the helicopter. The door gunners returned fire with their M240 machine guns, suppressing the threats while Sarah ran the last 50 meters to the aircraft. She dove through the helicopter's open door just as the pilot pulled collective and lifted off. Bullets spanked against the aircraft's armored floor as they gained altitude and speed, leaving the enemy fighters behind in the darkness. "Are you hit?" The crew chief shouted over the engine noise, checking Sarah for wounds. Sarah shook her head, breathing heavily from the sprint to the landing zone. "I'm good. Thanks for the pickup." The helicopter banked toward the south, heading for the forward operating base where the SEAL team was already waiting. Through the aircraft's window, Sarah could see muzzle flashes still flickering in the village below as the enemy fighters fired futilely at the departing aircraft. "Hell of a night," the crew chief commented, offering Sarah a bottle of water. "The ground team was full of praise for your shooting. Said you saved their lives up there." Sarah accepted the water gratefully, but said nothing. She knew that her decision to disobey Thompson's orders would have consequences. In the military, following orders was paramount, even when those orders might result in friendly casualties. But she also knew that 4 SEALs were alive because of her actions. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant accepting the consequences of disobeying the wrong orders. The rest of the flight passed in silence as Sarah reflected on the night's events. The mission had been a disaster in terms of its original objectives. The high-value targets had escaped, and intelligence about the compound had been completely inaccurate. But the team had extracted safely, and that was a victory in its own right. As the helicopter approached the forward operating base, Sarah could see Thompson and his team waiting on the landing pad. Their body language suggested that they were debriefing with senior officers, probably explaining how their routine operation had turned into a major firefight. The aircraft touched down gently, and Sarah climbed out with her equipment. Thompson approached her immediately, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "We need to talk," he said simply. Sarah nodded and followed him toward the operations center. She knew that her military career might be over before sunrise. Disobeying direct orders in combat was a serious offense, regardless of the outcome. But as they walked across the dusty compound, Thompson surprised her with his first comment. "That was some of the finest shooting I've ever seen," he said quietly. 17 targets eliminated at ranges up to 900 meters, all at night. "You saved our asses up there." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "But I disobeyed your orders." Thompson stopped walking and turned to face her. "You did exactly what needed to be done. My orders were wrong, and you had the judgment to recognize that. In combat, results matter more than procedure." They continued toward the operations center where Sarah would write her after-action report and face whatever consequences awaited. But for the first time since the mission began, she felt confident that she had made the right choices. The war in Afghanistan continued, and there would be more missions, more challenges, and more opportunities to prove herself in a profession that still struggled to accept women in combat roles. But tonight had been different. Tonight, even the skeptics had to acknowledge what she brought to the fight. As they reached the operations center, Thompson paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm putting you in for a commendation. What you did up there was extraordinary, and people need to know about it." Sarah smiled for the first time since the mission began. Recognition was nice, but it wasn't why she did the job. She did it for moments like these, when professionalism and mutual respect transcended the artificial barriers that society tried to impose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new doubts from those who questioned her place on the battlefield. But tonight, she had proven herself once again in the most unforgiving arena of all. When the question came, "Where's the shooter?" she had provided the answer with deadly precision and unwavering courage. The desert war continued, and Sarah Chun would be ready for whatever it demanded of her. Next, the forward operating base felt different when Sarah returned from her 2-week leave. The familiar sounds of helicopters and generators still filled the air, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Conversations stopped when she walked past groups of soldiers, and she caught whispered discussions that ceased abruptly when participants noticed her approach. Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, had requested to see her immediately upon her return. His office was located in the main command building, a concrete structure that served as the nerve center for operations throughout the province. Sarah had only been in his office once before, during her initial arrival briefing 6 months earlier. "Sergeant Chun, please have a seat," Morrison said as she entered his office. His tone was formal, but not hostile, the kind of measured politeness that senior officers used when discussing difficult subjects. Sarah remained standing. "Sir, I prefer to stand if that's acceptable." Morrison nodded and got straight to the point. "There have been some developments while you were on leave. I wanted to brief you personally before you heard about it through unofficial channels." Sarah's stomach tightened. In the military, personal briefings from colonels were rarely about good news. 3 days ago, we conducted a raid on a Taliban safe house in the Pesh Valley, Morrison continued. The operation was based on intelligence provided by one of our Afghan National Army liaison officers, a man named Captain Rashid Ahmad. Sarah knew Ahmad by reputation. He was one of the more competent ANA officers, someone who had worked closely with American forces for over 2 years. His intelligence had been reliable in the past, leading to several successful operations against Taliban forces. "The raid went bad," Morrison said bluntly. "It was an ambush. We lost 2 Rangers and had 4 more wounded. The Taliban were waiting for us, positioned perfectly to maximize casualties on our entry team." The implications were clear, but Sarah waited for the colonel to spell them out. "Captain Ahmad has disappeared. He hasn't been seen since the day before the raid, and his family claims they don't know where he is. We believe he's been compromised, either through coercion or payment." Sarah nodded, understanding the tactical situation, but not yet grasping why she was receiving this briefing. Morrison continued, "The reason I'm telling you this is because Ahmad had access to mission briefs for operations you supported, including detailed information about sniper positions and overwatch procedures." The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind. If Ahmad was feeding information to the Taliban, then every mission she had participated in could have been compromised. The enemy might know her tactics, her preferred positions, even her personal equipment specifications. "Sir, are you telling me that my operations have been compromised?" Sarah asked. "It's a possibility we have to consider," Morrison replied. "Ahmad had access to after-action reports from your missions, including the village engagement 3 weeks ago and the mountain operation that followed. He would have known details about your positioning, your effective range, and your impact on those operations." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the colonel's office. If the Taliban knew her capabilities and methods, they would be prepared for her on future missions. They might even set traps specifically designed to target her. "What does this mean for my operational status?" she asked. Morrison looked uncomfortable. "For now, you're being pulled from direct action missions. We need time to assess the security breach and determine what information might have been compromised. You'll be assigned to training duties and base security until further notice." Sarah had expected this, but it still felt like a physical blow. Training duties were important, but they weren't why she had volunteered for deployment to Afghanistan. She was a sniper, trained to support combat operations, not to conduct marksmanship classes for rear echelon personnel. "Sir, with respect, removing me from operations because of a possible security breach seems like letting the enemy win," Sarah said carefully. "If Ahmad was compromised, then all our operations were at risk, not just the ones I supported." Morrison nodded. "You're right, and that's why we're conducting a comprehensive review of all operations that Ahmad had access to. But your role as a sniper makes you particularly vulnerable. If the Taliban know your methods, they can specifically prepare to counter you. The colonel stood and moved to a wall map of the province. Red pins marked locations of recent enemy activity, while blue pins showed friendly bases and outposts. "There's something else," Morrison said, his back still turned to Sarah. "Intelligence suggests that the Taliban are specifically targeting female coalition personnel. They consider women in combat roles to be particularly valuable propaganda targets." Sarah had heard rumors about this, but Morrison was confirming her worst fears. Being a female sniper didn't just make her unusual within her own forces. It made her a high-priority target for the enemy. "The bottom line is this," Morrison continued, turning back to face her. "Until we can assess the full scope of the security breach, you're too valuable and too vulnerable to risk on direct action missions. I know it's not what you want to hear, but it's the best decision for both you and the teams you support." Sarah wanted to argue, to point out that risk was an inherent part of military operations and that removing her from missions would actually make those missions more dangerous for the ground teams. But she also understood the colonel's position. He was responsible for the safety of all personnel under his command, and he couldn't ignore a credible threat. "Understood, sir," Sarah replied. "What are my specific duties while I'm on this restricted status?" Morrison handed her a manila folder. "You'll be working with Sergeant First Class Williams in the training section. He's been asking for help with advanced marksmanship instruction for our support personnel. You'll also be assigned to the base defense force, with responsibility for one of the perimeter watchtowers." Sarah accepted the folder without enthusiasm. Guard duty and training assignments were necessary functions, but they felt like a step backward in her career. She had worked hard to earn her position as a sniper, and now she was being relegated to teaching basic marksmanship to clerks and mechanics. "There's one more thing," Morrison said as she prepared to leave. "This conversation is classified. The details about Ahmed's potential compromise cannot be discussed outside of official channels. If word gets out that we suspect him of being a double agent, it could endanger other sources and ongoing operations." Sarah nodded and left the colonel's office with mixed emotions. She understood the security concerns and the need for operational security, but she also felt frustrated by her removal from active duty. For the past 6 months, she had been making a real difference in the war, protecting ground teams and eliminating threats. Now she would be watching the war from the sidelines. The training facility was located on the opposite side of the base from the command building. It consisted of several buildings housing classrooms, equipment storage, and administrative offices. Sergeant First Class Williams was waiting for her in the main office, a stack of training schedules spread across his desk. Williams was an experienced infantry NCO who had been assigned to training duties after being wounded in an IED attack 6 months earlier. He walked with a slight limp, a reminder of the shrapnel that had ended his combat deployment, but his knowledge of tactics and weapons was encyclopedic. "Sergeant Chun, good to have you aboard," Williams said as she entered his office. "I've been looking forward to working with someone with your background. We got a lot of people here who need to improve their shooting skills." Sarah spent the rest of the day reviewing training schedules and familiarizing herself with the facilities. The marksmanship range was adequate but basic, designed for qualification shoots rather than advanced training. The equipment was older but well-maintained, and there was enough ammunition allocated for meaningful instruction. Her first students would be a mixed group of support personnel, mechanics, communication specialists, and administrative staff. These soldiers rarely left the base, but everyone needed to be proficient with their assigned weapons in case the base came under attack. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She had gone from eliminating enemy fighters at ranges exceeding 800 meters to teaching support personnel how to hit targets at 50 meters. But she reminded herself that all training was valuable, and these soldiers deserved the best instruction she could provide. Over the next few days, Sarah settled into her new routine. She spent mornings conducting marksmanship classes and afternoons pulling guard duty in Tower 7, one of the elevated positions that provided overwatch for the base's northern perimeter. The guard duty was mind-numbingly boring. The tower offered an excellent view of the surrounding terrain, but the area had been quiet for months. The Taliban rarely conducted direct attacks on fortified positions like the forward operating base, preferring to engage coalition forces during movement operations or at remote outposts. Sarah used the quiet hours to maintain her own skills, practicing with a spotting scope to identify targets at extended ranges. She also studied intelligence reports, trying to stay current with enemy activities in the province, even though she was no longer directly involved in operations against them. It was during one of these guard shifts that she first noticed the unusual activity. A convoy of Afghan National Army vehicles had arrived at the base that morning, ostensibly to deliver supplies and coordinate joint operations. But Sarah observed that some of the ANA soldiers were paying unusual attention to the base's defensive positions, taking what appeared to be photographs with concealed cameras. The behavior was subtle, and it would have been easy to dismiss as normal curiosity. But Sarah's training had taught her to notice details that others might miss, and something about the soldiers' conduct set off alarm bells in her mind. She documented what she observed, noting the time and specific behaviors of the suspicious individuals. But when she reported her concerns to the tower supervisor, she was told to focus on external threats rather than friendly forces within the base perimeter. The response frustrated Sarah, but she continued her observations. Over the next several days, she noticed a pattern. Certain ANA soldiers consistently showed interest in the base's defenses, communication equipment, and helicopter landing areas. They were conducting reconnaissance, but for what purpose? Sarah's concerns intensified when she recognized one of the ANA soldiers as someone she had seen in Captain Ahmed's unit. The man was supposed to be operating in a different province, yet here he was at their base, taking what appeared to be intelligence photographs. She documented everything meticulously, creating a detailed log of suspicious activities and individuals. But when she tried to report her concerns through official channels, she encountered bureaucratic obstacles. Her restricted operational status meant that her intelligence reports were given lower priority, and her concerns about the ANA soldiers were dismissed as paranoia. The breakthrough came during her 4th week of guard duty. Sarah was manning Tower 7 during the early morning hours when she observed a clandestine meeting taking place near the base perimeter. One of the suspicious ANA soldiers was talking quietly with a local national who had somehow gained access to the base despite strict security protocols. Sarah watched through her spotting scope as the local national handed the soldier what appeared to be a small package. In return, the soldier gave the man what looked like documents or photographs. The exchange was brief and carefully concealed, but Sarah had a clear view from her elevated position. She immediately radioed the base security office, requesting backup to investigate the suspicious activity. But by the time security personnel arrived at the location, both individuals had disappeared. The investigating team found no evidence of the meeting Sarah had observed. "Are you sure about what you saw?" the security team leader asked Sarah after completing his investigation. "There's nothing here to suggest any kind of meeting took place." Sarah was certain of what she had witnessed, but she also understood the team leader's skepticism. Without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, her report would be difficult to substantiate. And her recent removal from operational duties due to security concerns would make some people question her judgment. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of relying on official channels that seemed unwilling to take her concerns seriously, she would conduct her own investigation. If there was a security breach at the base, she would find evidence that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. She began by reviewing base security camera footage, looking for evidence of the meeting she had witnessed. The cameras were positioned to monitor access points and key facilities, but they had limited coverage of the perimeter areas where the suspicious activity had taken place. Sarah spent hours reviewing footage from multiple cameras, looking for any sign of the individuals she had observed. She found several images that showed the suspicious ANA soldier in areas where he had no legitimate business, but nothing that clearly documented the exchange she had witnessed. Her investigation led her to examine communication logs and visitor records, looking for patterns that might indicate insider threats. What she found was even more disturbing than she had expected. The local national she had seen meeting with the ANA soldier was listed as a regular visitor to the base, someone who supposedly provided cleaning services for the administrative buildings. But Sarah discovered that his visits always coincided with major operational planning sessions, and he had access to areas of the base that contained sensitive information. She also found evidence that Captain Ahmad had visited the base twice in the weeks before his disappearance, meetings that weren't reflected in the official visitor logs. If Ahmad was indeed compromised, these visits could have provided him with current intelligence about base operations and defenses. Sarah compiled her findings into a comprehensive report, documenting the suspicious activities and possible security breaches she had uncovered. But she knew that presenting this information through normal channels would likely result in it being buried or dismissed. Instead, she decided to take her concerns directly to Colonel Morrison. It was a risky move that could result in disciplinary action for bypassing the chain of command, but she believed the security threat was too serious to ignore. Morrison's reaction to her report was immediate and decisive. Within hours of their meeting, base security had detained the suspicious ANA soldiers and the local national who had been providing cleaning services. A thorough search of their quarters and belongings revealed communication equipment, photographs of base defenses, and detailed notes about helicopter schedules and personnel routines. The evidence confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The base had been under surveillance by Taliban agents for weeks, and they had been preparing for some kind of attack or operation. The information they had gathered would have been devastating if it had fallen into the wrong hands. Colonel Morrison called Sarah back to his office the next day, this time with a much different agenda. "Sergeant Chun, your investigation prevented what could have been a catastrophic security breach," he said without preamble. "The individuals you identified were planning to provide targeting information for a mortar attack on our helicopter pad. Your vigilance and initiative saved lives." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and validation. Her concerns had been real, and her decision to pursue them despite official skepticism had been justified. However, Morrison continued, "Your methods were unconventional, to say the least. Conducting your own investigation without authorization was outside the bounds of normal procedure." Sarah braced herself for disciplinary action, but Morrison surprised her with his next statement. "Under normal circumstances, I'd have to write you up for exceeding your authority. But these weren't normal circumstances, and your results speak for themselves. Instead, I'm recommending you for a commendation and immediate return to operational status." The news was better than Sarah had dared to hope. Not only would she avoid disciplinary action, but she would be returning to the mission she loved. "The security breach has been contained," Morrison explained. "We've identified and neutralized the immediate threat, and we've implemented new procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. Your operational security is no longer a concern." Sarah left the colonel's office with renewed purpose and energy. Her weeks in training and guard duty had been frustrating, but they had also led to uncovering a serious threat to the base and its personnel. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not on distant battlefields, but in the shadows where enemies tried to gain advantage through deception and betrayal. That evening, she received word that she would be assigned to a new mission the following week. A high-value target had been located in a remote mountain village, and a SEAL team would be conducting a capture operation. They needed sniper overwatch, and Sarah had been specifically requested for the mission. As she prepared her equipment and reviewed intelligence reports, Sarah reflected on the events of the past month. The security breach had been a reminder that in modern warfare, The enemy was often closer than anyone realized. But it had also reinforced her belief in the importance of attention to detail and the courage to act on one's convictions. The war in Afghanistan continued, and new challenges awaited. But Sarah Chun was ready to return to the fight, armed with hard-won experience and an even stronger commitment to protecting the warriors who depended on her skills and judgment. Tomorrow would bring new missions and new opportunities to answer that familiar question: where's the shooter? And when that question came, Sarah would be ready with precision, professionalism, and unwavering dedication to the mission. The briefing room was packed with personnel from multiple units, creating an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos as officers and NCOs tried to coordinate what would be the largest operation Sarah had participated in during her deployment. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins and overlays that showed enemy positions, friendly forces, and potential routes of approach. Major Sarah Hendricks, the operation commander, stood at the front of the room with a laser pointer outlining the mission parameters for the assembled task force. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had planned and executed dozens of similar operations. But Sarah could detect an underlying tension that suggested this mission was different from the routine raids that had become commonplace. The target is Kari Nasrallah, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the Kunar province, Hendricks explained, clicking to the next slide in her presentation. Intelligence indicates he'll be attending a meeting of regional Taliban leaders in the village of Gyan, approximately 40 kilometers northeast of our current position. Sarah studied the aerial photographs of the target area displayed on the main screen. Gyan was a remote mountain village accessible only by narrow trails that wound through steep terrain. The village itself consisted of perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a central mosque, surrounded by terraced fields carved into the mountainside. The challenge, Hendricks continued, is that Nasrallah rarely stays in one location for more than a few hours. This meeting represents our best opportunity to capture or eliminate him before he disappears back into the tribal areas where we can't pursue him. The major clicked to a detailed topographical map showing the village and surrounding terrain. The operation will consist of 3 phases. Phase 1 involves inserting 2 SEAL teams at separate locations to establish containment around the village. Phase 2 is the actual assault on the target building. Phase 3 is extraction and exfiltration of all friendly forces. Sarah raised her hand. Ma'am, what's the timeline for the operation? The meeting is scheduled to begin at 1,400 hours tomorrow, Hendricks replied. We'll insert the containment teams at 1,200 hours and begin the assault at 1,430 hours, giving the SEALs time to get into position before the targets arrive. One of the SEAL team leaders spoke up. What about sniper overwatch? The terrain around that village offers some excellent elevated positions. Hendricks nodded and gestured towards Sarah. Sergeant Chun will provide overwatch from a position on the ridgeline approximately 800 meters north of the village. Her position will allow her to cover both the assault team and the containment teams if they encounter resistance. Sarah examined the proposed sniper position on the map. It was well chosen, offering excellent fields of fire and multiple escape routes if she needed to relocate. But the range to some parts of the village would exceed 1,000 meters, pushing the limits of even her considerable skills. Ma'am, I noticed that the maximum range to some target areas will be over 1,000 meters, Sarah said. At that distance, environmental factors become much more significant. Wind, temperature, and humidity can all affect bullet trajectory. Hendricks acknowledged the concern with a nod. Understood. If targets are beyond your effective range, priority goes to protecting the assault teams. We'd rather let some enemies escape than risk friendly fire incidents. The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from helicopter insertion routes to emergency extraction procedures. Sarah took detailed notes, paying particular attention to the timing and positioning of the various team elements. In complex operations like this, coordination was critical to preventing fratricide and ensuring mission success. After the briefing, Sarah spent several hours studying recent weather reports and atmospheric conditions for the target area. Wind patterns in mountain regions were notoriously unpredictable, and she would need to account for multiple variables when calculating her shots. She also reviewed intelligence reports about enemy strength in the village. The estimates suggested that Nasrallah would be accompanied by a security detail of 8 to 12 fighters, plus whatever local Taliban might be present for the meeting. The total enemy force could range from 15 to 30 individuals, a significant number for the assault teams to handle. That evening, Sarah conducted a detailed inspection of her equipment. Her Barrett M82 rifle had been completely overhauled by the base armorer, and she had requisitioned match-grade ammunition for the mission. Every piece of equipment was checked and rechecked from her spotting scope to her communication gear. She also spent time reviewing ballistic tables for the specific ammunition she would be using. At extreme ranges, even small variations in bullet weight or powder charge could result in significant changes in point of impact. The difference between a hit and a miss at 1,000 meters might be measured in fractions of a grain of gunpowder. The insertion flight departed the forward operating base at 0800 hours the following morning. Sarah was alone in a helicopter except for the crew, while the SEAL teams flew in separate aircraft to their insertion points. The flight path took them through mountain valleys that offered concealment from enemy observers while providing access to the target area. The helicopter crew chief pointed out landmarks as they approached Sarah's insertion point. "That ridgeline to the north is your objective," he shouted over the engine noise. "We'll drop you about 2 clicks away, and you'll have to hike in from there." Sarah acknowledged with a thumbs up and began her final preparations. The helicopter would not wait for her. Once she was on the ground, she would be on her own until the extraction aircraft arrived at the designated pickup point. The aircraft flared for landing in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. Sarah grabbed her equipment and jumped out, immediately moving away from the landing zone as the helicopter departed. The sound of rotor blades faded quickly, leaving her alone in the mountain wilderness. The hike to her overwatch position took 90 minutes through terrain that challenged even her excellent physical conditioning. The altitude was nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, and the thin air made every step an effort. But Sarah maintained a steady pace, knowing that she needed to be in position well before the SEAL teams began their assault. She reached the designated position with 30 minutes to spare before the operation began. The location was everything she had hoped for. Excellent concealment among the rocks and vegetation, multiple fields of fire covering the entire village, and several escape routes if she needed to relocate quickly. Sarah set up her shooting position carefully, using natural features to create a stable platform for her rifle. She tested her radio communications with the various team elements and received confirmation that all units were in position and ready to begin the operation. Through her spotting scope, she could see the village spread out below her. The central mosque was clearly visible, along with the building where intelligence suggested the Taliban meeting would take place. Several vehicles had arrived during the past hour, including a pickup truck with a mounted machine gun that posed a potential threat to the assault teams. "All stations, this is command." Major Hendrick's voice came through Sarah's radio. "We have confirmation that our primary target has arrived in the village. All teams stand by to execute on my command." Sarah adjusted her scope settings and began calculating firing solutions for various target areas throughout the village. Wind conditions were variable, with gusts that could affect bullet trajectory at the extreme ranges she might need to engage. "Execute, execute, execute," Hendricks commanded. The SEAL teams began their movement immediately, approaching the village from multiple directions in a coordinated assault. Sarah watched their progress through her scope, ready to provide covering fire if they encountered resistance. The first sign of enemy activity came from the building with a mounted machine gun. A Taliban fighter climbed into the truck bed and began swiveling the weapon toward the approaching SEAL team. The range was nearly 900 meters, requiring Sarah to account for significant bullet drop and wind drift. She settled the crosshairs on the gunner's chest and began her breathing cycle. The wind was gusting from left to right at approximately 10 miles per hour, requiring her to aim slightly into the wind to compensate for drift. The shot broke clean, and Sarah watched through her scope as the bullet found its target. The gunner slumped forward over his weapon, eliminating the machine gun threat to the assault team. "Good shot, Overwatch," one of the SEAL team leaders reported. "That gun could have pinned us down indefinitely." More enemy fighters began appearing throughout the village as the Taliban realized they were under attack. Sarah systematically engaged targets that posed the greatest threat to the ground teams, prioritizing anyone with crew-served weapons or explosives. A fighter with an RPG appeared on a rooftop to the east of the main target building. The range was over 1,000 meters, at the extreme edge of Sarah's effective range. She would need to account for nearly 40 inches of bullet drop at that distance, along with wind drift and the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation. Sarah made her calculations quickly, adjusting her scope and aiming point to compensate for all the environmental factors affecting her shot. The crosshairs settled on a point several feet above and to the left of her actual target, accounting for the bullet's trajectory at the extended range. The shot felt perfect as it broke, but at 1,000 meters, it took nearly 2 seconds for the bullet to reach its target. Sarah watched through her scope as the fighter raised the RPG to his shoulder, seemingly unaffected by her shot. Then, the .50 caliber round struck him center mass, and he disappeared from view as the massive bullet's impact sent him tumbling backward off the rooftop. The RPG fired wildly into the air, exploding harmlessly against a distant hillside. "Outstanding shooting, Overwatch," Rodriguez's voice came through the radio. He had been assigned as the overall ground commander for the operation. "How the hell did you make that shot at that range?" Sarah didn't have time to respond. More threats were appearing as the Taliban attempted to organize a defense of the village. She engaged a sniper who was trying to target the SEALs from a second-story window, then shifted to eliminate a fighter who was attempting to flank one of the containment teams. The assault on the main target building was progressing smoothly when everything suddenly went wrong. Intelligence reports had been incorrect about the number of enemy fighters in the village. Instead of the 15 to 30 opponents they had expected, the SEALs were facing a force of nearly 60 Taliban fighters who had been attending the meeting. "All stations, this is Ground Commander." Rodriguez's voice was tense with the stress of combat. "We have heavy resistance throughout the village. Enemy strength is much higher than anticipated. Request immediate close air support." Sarah could see the tactical situation developing through her scope. The SEAL teams were well-trained and disciplined, but they were outnumbered 2-1 by an enemy force that was fighting on familiar terrain. The Taliban had turned the village into a fortress, using buildings and walls to create interlocking fields of fire. "Air support is 20 minutes out," Hendricks replied. "All teams need to hold position until the jets arrive." 20 minutes was an eternity in combat, especially when ammunition was running low and the enemy was attempting to encircle the friendly forces. Sarah realized that her role had suddenly become much more critical than anyone had anticipated. She began engaging targets with methodical precision, prioritizing threats in order of danger to the ground teams. A fighter with a machine gun took precedence over someone with a rifle. Anyone carrying grenades or explosives was eliminated immediately. But her ammunition was running critically low. She had started the mission with 40 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and she was down to her last magazine. Each shot had to count more than ever. "Ground Commander, this is Overwatch," Sarah called on the radio. "I'm running low on ammunition. I could support for maybe 10 more minutes, then I'll be down on my M4. Rodriguez's response was immediate. "Understood, Overwatch. Prioritize crew-served weapons and anyone with explosives. We can handle individual riflemen." A new threat appeared as Sarah watched through her scope. A group of Taliban fighters was attempting to position a mortar behind one of the buildings, where it would be protected from ground-level fire, but able to rain down shells on the SEAL positions. The mortar crew consisted of 3 men, and they were moving their weapon into position with practiced efficiency. Once operational, the mortar would be devastating against the clustered SEAL teams who had limited mobility due to the enemy fire. Sarah had 6 rounds left in her magazine. The range to the mortar position was approximately 800 meters, a challenging but manageable shot under normal circumstances. But the targets were partially concealed behind a low wall, and she would have only brief opportunities to engage them as they exposed themselves to operate their weapon. She waited patiently, watching as the mortar crew continued their setup. The gunner knelt behind the weapon, adjusting its elevation while his assistant prepared the first round for firing. The third man served as a lookout, scanning for threats while the others worked. Sarah's first shot took the gunner as he leaned forward to sight the mortar. Her second shot eliminated the assistant as he reached for another round. The third fighter attempted to flee, but Sarah's final shot caught him before he could reach cover. The mortar threat was neutralized, but Sarah was now down to her M4 carbine and its much more limited range. At her distance from the village, the carbine was ineffective against most targets, leaving the ground teams without their long-range overwatch. All stations, this is air support. A new voice came through the radio. We have 2 F-16s inbound to your position, armed with precision-guided munitions. Can someone talk us on targets? Rodriguez immediately responded. Air support, this is ground commander. We need immediate strikes on enemy positions throughout the village. Our overwatch is out of long-range ammunition. Sarah watched as the fighter aircraft appeared over the village, circling at high altitude while the pilots coordinated with the ground teams. Within minutes, the sound of explosions echoed across the mountains as precision bombs eliminated the remaining Taliban strongpoints. The tide of battle shifted dramatically with the arrival of close air support. Enemy resistance collapsed as the surviving Taliban fighters fled into the surrounding mountains, abandoning their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape. All stations, this is Ground Commander, Rodriguez announced. Village is secure. Primary target is confirmed dead, along with multiple secondary targets. Begin preparation for extraction. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction as she began breaking down her position. The mission had been more challenging than anyone had anticipated, but it had been completed successfully. The SEAL teams had eliminated their primary target and disrupted a major Taliban meeting, dealing a significant blow to enemy operations in the province. The extraction helicopter arrived 30 minutes later, landing in the same clearing where Sarah had been inserted that morning. She climbed aboard with her equipment, exhausted but triumphant. Hell of a day's work, the crew chief commented as the helicopter lifted off. The ground teams were full of praise for your shooting. They said you saved their asses up there. Sarah nodded, but remained quiet during the flight back to base. The mission had pushed her skills to their absolute limit, requiring shots at ranges that most snipers would consider impossible. But she had risen to the challenge, adapting to changing circumstances and maintaining her effectiveness even when the tactical situation deteriorated. As the helicopter approached the forward operating base, Sarah could see personnel waiting on the landing pad to debrief the returning teams. Major Hendricks was among them, along with Colonel Morrison and several other senior officers. The aircraft touched down gently, and Sarah climbed out with her equipment. Hendricks approached her immediately, her expression reflecting both relief and admiration. Sergeant Chun, that was extraordinary shooting today, Hendricks said. The ground teams reported that you eliminated threats at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. That's sniper work of the highest caliber. Sarah smiled, tired but genuine. Thank you, ma'am. Just doing my job. But privately, she knew that today had been special. She had been tested under the most demanding circumstances possible and had proven herself capable of rising to any challenge. The impossible shot had become possible through training, skill, and determination. As she walked toward the operations center to begin her after-action report, Sarah reflected on the day's events. The mission had been a success not just tactically, but personally. She had demonstrated that gender was irrelevant when it came to combat effectiveness, earning the respect of even the most skeptical operators. The war in Afghanistan would continue, and there would be more missions that tested her abilities and resolve. But today had shown that when the question came, "Where's the shooter?" Sarah Chun would always be ready with an answer that exceeded everyone's expectations. The impossible had become routine, and she was exactly where she belonged. The final answer 6 months later. Sarah found herself in a position she had never anticipated when she first deployed to Afghanistan. She was sitting across from a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., wearing her dress uniform and preparing to testify about the role of women in combat operations. The ornate hearing room felt surreal after months of living in dusty forward operating bases and mountainous terrain. The committee chairman, Representative Michael Patterson from Texas, reviewed his notes before looking up at Sarah. His expression was neutral but not unfriendly, the practiced demeanor of a politician who had conducted hundreds of similar hearings. "Sergeant Chun, thank you for appearing before this committee today," Patterson began. "We're here to examine the effectiveness of current policies regarding women in combat roles, and your experiences in Afghanistan are directly relevant to our deliberations." Sarah had prepared extensively for this moment, working with military lawyers and public affairs officers to ensure her testimony would be both accurate and appropriate. But she also knew that her words could influence policy decisions that would affect thousands of other women seeking to serve in combat roles. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to be here," Sarah replied. Representative Patricia Williams from California, one of 3 women on the committee, leaned forward with her first question. "Sergeant Chun, could you describe your role in Afghanistan and the types of missions you supported?" Sarah had anticipated this question and provided a concise but comprehensive overview of her duties. "Ma'am, I serve as a sniper providing overwatch for special operations teams conducting direct action missions. My responsibilities included eliminating threats to ground forces, gathering intelligence through observation, and providing early warning of enemy activities." "How many combat missions did you participate in during your deployment?" Williams continued. "I provided sniper support for 37 combat operations over the course of 11 months, Sarah answered. These range from small unit patrols to complex multi-team raids involving up to 50 personnel. Representative James Crawford from Georgia, who had been vocal in his opposition to women in combat roles, shifted in his seat. "Sergeant Chun, I have to ask the obvious question. Do you believe that your gender affected your performance or the performance of the teams you supported?" Sarah had known this question was coming, and she had thought carefully about her response. "Sir, I believe my performance should be evaluated based on results rather than demographics. During my deployment, I eliminated 63 enemy combatants in direct support of friendly forces. 0 friendly personnel were lost during operations where I provided overwatch support. The statistics were impressive, but Crawford pressed further. But surely you must have encountered situations where your physical limitations or the attitudes of male personnel created challenges?" Sarah considered her response carefully. "Sir, every soldier has limitations, regardless of gender. The key is to maximize strengths while minimizing weaknesses. My smaller size allowed me to take positions that might not accommodate larger personnel. My attention to detail and patience served me well in long-duration observation missions." Representative Williams nodded approvingly. "Can you provide specific examples of how your presence affected mission outcomes?" Sarah described several of her missions in general terms, careful not to reveal classified information while still illustrating her contributions. She talked about the village engagement, where she had eliminated 17 enemy fighters, the night operation where she had saved a pinned-down SEAL team, and the long-range shots that had prevented mortar attacks on friendly forces. In each case, Sarah concluded, my value to the team was determined by my ability to accomplish the mission, not by my gender. The men I served with judged me based on my performance and professionalism. Representative David Kim from Washington State asked about the challenges she had faced. Were there instances where you encountered discrimination or harassment because of your gender? Sarah chose her words carefully. Sir, I've encountered some initial skepticism from personnel who hadn't worked with female snipers before. But in every case, that skepticism was overcome through demonstrated competence and professionalism. The military is a merit-based organization, and results speak louder than preconceptions. Chairman Patterson looked up from his notes. Sergeant Chun, this committee has heard testimony from some who argue that the presence of women in combat units creates unnecessary complications and distractions. How would you respond to those concerns? Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared what she believed was her most important answer of the day. Mr. Chairman, during my deployment, I worked alongside some of the most professional and dedicated soldiers in the world. These men were focused on mission accomplishment and bringing everyone home safely. Gender was irrelevant compared to those priorities. She paused before continuing. I believe the concerns about complications and distractions are based on assumptions rather than evidence. My experience suggests that properly trained and led personnel can integrate effectively regardless of gender. Representative Crawford wasn't satisfied with that answer. But surely you can't deny that there are inherent physical differences between men and women that affect combat effectiveness. Sarah nodded. You're correct that there are physical differences, sir. But combat effectiveness depends on much more than raw physical strength. Marksmanship, tactical thinking, situational awareness, and emotional stability under pressure are equally important, and these qualities aren't determined by gender. Williams leaned forward with another question. How did the special operations personnel you supported react to working with a female sniper? Sarah smiled slightly. Ma'am, after my first mission, the most common reaction was to request me specifically for their operations. Master Chief Rodriguez, who was initially skeptical of my capabilities, later recommended me for a Bronze Star Medal. Chief Thompson wrote in his evaluation that I was the most effective sniper support he had worked with in 15 years of special operations. The hearing continued for another hour, with representatives asking detailed questions about training standards, physical requirements, and integration policies. Sarah answered each question thoughtfully, drawing on her experiences while remaining professional and factual. Representative Patterson asked the final question of the day. Sergeant Chun, if you could make one recommendation to this committee regarding the future of women in combat roles, what would it be? Sarah had thought about this moment throughout her entire deployment. Mr. Chairman, I would recommend that personnel be evaluated based on their ability to meet objective standards rather than their gender. If someone can